Hey guys, and welcome back. I'm glad you're still here. We're gonna go over ability scores. Now you might say, what the heck are ability scores? Okay, ability scores are these. They're your strength, your dexterity, your constitution, your intelligence, your wisdom, and your charisma. They are the basis of all skills in the game. If you look over here and you see all these other skills, which we'll go over later, don't freak out. Like diplomacy, I joke about it all the time. It is a charisma-based stat, so whatever points you have in this will help determine how well you will do in this. Everything that you do in the game, especially with combat, orients to strength, or with rogues, it orients to dexterity, or with wizards and sorcerers, things like that, it goes from intelligence and wisdom, and your constitution is a part of your overall health. So these stats are very important to determining what kind of character you want to make. So before we even decide where we're going to put these, we want to know exactly what they are. And I'll go over races and classes. So that way you can look at all of them first and then say, okay, before you ever put these ability scores in, you will want to know what you're playing, because then you can help decide what you should put where, because you don't really want to be putting your highest stat into strength when you're playing a wizard. You'd probably want to put it into something like intelligence, if I remember correctly. So you want to know what you're playing ahead of time before you apply these ability scores. But before you do any of that, you have to know what they are. So I'm going to go over them for you in this video. Yay! Ability scores. And I will also go over ability modifiers. As you can see, if you're following along, they stick ability modifiers like at the beginning of the chapter. I'm not going to go over it until the end, after I've gone over all of the abilities. So let's get started. We're going to go ahead and go here. We're going to start with strength. A lot of what I'm going to read is directly from the book, because I got this big fancy book here. And so if you want to read along, you'll see that there is a lot of stuff down here that they mention that I will not talk about. That is because it is very combat oriented, and I will go back to it later and explain why it's important. For now, I think that you should understand what these things are. The book sets it up for reference. If you read this and you skim over it and then you come back to it later, it's in a very convenient spot. You're like, well, how does this relate? Well, I guess I should go back to the ability score chapter, and oh, there it is. So it's not really made for your learning convenience, which is why these videos are going to go back to it later. And if you want to go back to it later, you have this, and now you know, hey, it's on page 8. So let's jump forward. Let's talk about strength. Strength measures your character's muscle and physical power. This ability is especially important for fighters, barbarians, paladins, rangers, and monks, because it helps them prevail in combat. Strength also limits the amount of equipment your character can carry. We'll go over carry weight and how it relates to strength later. That's one of those things that gets confusing. Dexterity, obviously. Dexterity measures hand-eye coordination, agility, reflexes, and balance. So if you want to make a balance check, let's say, your characters are trying to pass over a ravine and you place a wooden plank between one side and the other and you want to walk across it, and you're going to have to make a check that directly relates to your dexterity. See how this all kind of starts to come into play? This ability is most important for rogues, but it is also high on the list for characters who typically wear light or medium armor, rangers and barbarians, for example, or no armor at all, like monks, wizards, and sorcerers, people who run around naked or in robes. For anyone who wants to be a skilled archer. So it's pretty self-explanatory in that defensive dexterity is nimbleness, essentially. Next we go down to Constitution, probably one of the most important stats. Constitution represents your character's health and stamina. A Constitution bonus increases your hit points, so the ability is important for all classes. You want to have a decent amount of hit points, at least as much as you possibly can. The hit points vary between classes, so a wizard is not going to have as much hit points as a fighter does, in general. So you want to make sure that you try to put a really good roll in Constitution, because it'll help you out down the line. Intelligence. Intelligence determines how well your character learns and reasons. This ability is important for wizards because it affects how many spells they can cast, how hard their spells are to resist, and how powerful their spells can be. It is also important for your character, any character who wants to have a wide assortment of skills. We'll go over skills later and why intelligence is important, but essentially you get extra points to put into all of this stuff. So at first level you get 4 extra points, and usually you get a set amount of points. But if you have a lot of intelligence, you might get some extra points. And every level you get an extra point. I don't remember, I had to check exactly when that happens, but we will refer to that later. So wisdom. This is where it gets tricky. You're like, well, what's the difference between wisdom and intelligence? It's really very simple. Intelligence is book smarts. Wisdom is street smarts. Wisdom describes a character's willpower, common sense, perception, and intuition, while intelligence represents one's ability to analyze information. Wisdom represents being in tune and aware of one's surroundings. An absent-minded professor has low wisdom and high intelligence. A simpleton might have low intelligence, but might still have great insight about battle situations, so he would have high wisdom. Wisdom is the most important ability for clerics and druids, and is also important for paladins and rangers. If you want your character to have acute senses, put a high score in wisdom. And the last stat, my personal favorite, is charisma. Charisma is like, oh, I'm so pretty. Charisma measures a character's force of personality, persuasiveness, personal magnetism, ability to lead, and physical attractiveness. This ability represents actual strength of personality, not merely how one is perceived by others in a social setting. Charisma is most important for paladins, sorcerers, and bards, obviously, because nobody wants to listen to an ugly bard play a song. It is also important for clerics, since it affects their ability to turn undead. That sounds familiar. Now let's take a step back. Okay, so we've gone over all this, and you're like, yeah, I get it, yay, these are what those things are. Now let's look at ability modifiers. They threw the statue at the beginning of the chapter. I'm taking a step back, and I'm going to explain it to you as best I can my way. A modifier is a number ranging from -1 to -5. It directly relates and varies for each ability score. If you have an ability score that is high, typically your modifier will be positive. If it is low, it will likely be negative. The modifier is a number you apply to a die roll when your character tries to do something related to that ability. Do you remember how I talked about before? Now, diplomacy is a charisma stat, so this modifier will be added to your roll. And also the skill points you put into diplomacy will be added to whatever role you do that might orient to diplomacy. Let's say you want to convince a diplomat to give your party gold to help you out on your mission, and you're trying to talk them into it. You would want to roll a bluff check or a diplomacy check, depending if you're being honest or sneaky. So that kind of thing will affect it, and we're not going to get really deep into that until later, but you can kind of see where it's going. So modifiers are something that's kind of, there's a big chart in here, and I believe I note that modifiers can be affected by a lot of things, not just your ability, but also your race and things like that might take away or give you something. Like, for instance, I believe dwarves get +2 in Constitution, but they also get -2 in Charisma because they're not a very personable race. So if you wanted to make a tanky character who really shouldn't talk to anybody, you'd probably want to pick a dwarf as your race or something like that. So a lot of things affect modifiers, so we're not going to go too deep into the nitty-gritty of modifiers, but I will say that my book isn't loading. Oh no! No, it's a blank page. No, that's the page I needed. I was going to show you the chart, but apparently the chart is not here, so we're going to come back in. Does anybody remember what page we were on? Page 8? There it is. Okay. as you can see, let's say you have an ability score that's like 10 to 12, your modifier would be +1. So they have a nice fancy chart here for you to get your base modifier, and then you can work from there. We're not going to get into that right now. We're going to first talk about how to roll your ability scores. There are 6 of them. You have your strength, and you have your dexterity, constitution, me being a derp. If you go. Your strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. You're like, that's a lot of stuff. Okay, that's 6 rolls. We're going to go over how you roll these ability scores, how you get these. You want a scrap piece of paper, or Microsoft Word, or a notepad, and probably a calculator if you're horrible at math like me. So I'm going to give an example roll and show you how to do it. So you open a calculator, you got your dice roller up here, and you're like, okay, I'm not even going to worry about what stats you want to put where right now. Right now you just want to get your ability scores. And it says in the book that you want to roll. Let's see. I'm going to show you where it is so you can look at it later. It tells you right here, I believe. Between each bunch of data. Roll is too special. No, it doesn't. Why doesn't it tell you where to roll? I believe it's one of the other pages. I want to make sure you know where to look in case you forget. Rolling ability scores. Apparently, I can't find it. I'm just a horrible teacher. So, I will just tell you. In order to roll an ability score, you want to roll 4d6. One at a time, because this one will just add it all together. And that's not what you want to do. Let's say, okay, so I want to roll a d6 4 times. Roll. I got a 6. I'm like, yay, I got a 6. Let's open Notepad. Okay. Too big. Okay. So your first roll, you got a 6. Like, yeah, I got a 6. That's fantastic. That's the highest I can get. You roll again. I'm like, woohoo! I got a 5. So now you write down 5. He's like, oh, bad. Now I got that was a 1. That's really bad. And then you roll one more time. You're like, wow, another 1. That really sucks. Okay. So now you have 4 rolls total. You want to drop the lowest roll, and I'm really unfortunate and had 2 1s. So I dropped my lowest, one of my 1s, and then you add all of those together. Now open my nifty calculator, and I go 6 plus 5 plus 1, and that is 12. So let's go over that again. You roll a d6 4 individual times. Drop the lowest roll and add the 3 highest rolls together. All of that will equal your roll. So my first roll would be 12. And that would be one of my 6 ability scores. I do this 6 times. I'm not actually going to do it 6 times. I already have example rolls over here that I did earlier. So I did that 6 times, and now I have 6 numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Like, wow, there's a lot of numbers, and some of them are higher than others. The number will range between, usually between like 10 and 18. The worst possible number you can get is 3. So the best you can get is 8, and that's if you roll 3 6s. The worst you can get is 3, that's if you roll 4 1s, which is highly unlikely. Usually you'll get numbers that kind of range between like 10 and 15. And that's normal. So you want to get 6 of those numbers. And then you go to your character sheet and you go, where do I put these? No! You just stop right there. No. I was so into it, I hit my mic. Don't do anything with these. You have your numbers. Just go ahead and save them. Just save as blah, 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 blah. And you set them aside, or you write them down on a piece of paper and you put them aside for now. Right now, you want to focus on what your character is rather than where you're going to put your stats, because you can't decide where you're going to put your stats until you know what race you're playing. As I said, like dwarves have great constitution bonus. They get +2, but they have -2 to charisma. So you're not going to want to put your biggest stat in charisma. You're probably going to want to put it, you know, in your strength or your constitution to make you really buff and strong, which means you can't really know where you're going to put your abilities until you decide what race, what class you are going to play, because all of them take an effect on what ability scores you do and don't want in certain areas. So that is ability scores. Next we'll be going over races, and I will read to you all the races. I will be skipping some things that I will of course go over later. So thank you for watching, and please stay tuned for the rest of the stuff, because there's so much more wonderful things to go over.